Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, Daniel joins me and we're going to discuss AWS and how that applies for web developers. But before we kind of get into that, Daniel, could you give me a bit of your background when it comes to your tech career and then also how you kind of got into AWS?
Sure. And first of all, thanks for having me, Ryan. Excited to be here and love what you do on your channel and the podcast in general. So with regards to my tech career, I have about, I guess you could say, almost a decade of experience now in tech. I got into just tech and always been a tech guy. Like, let's be real. I love, tech gizmos and electronics and computers ever since I was a kid. So naturally I gravitated towards that. But in terms of my specific career, so my first job out of school while I was finishing my master's degree, I was doing an internship for a company called Blue Dot. And Blue Dot, it's a pretty relevant company. They study the spread of infectious diseases, which was very interesting given the past couple of years and where the world went. I never really saw that coming, to be honest with you. So I had some interesting connections there that kind of kept me in the loop. But originally when I was there, I was focusing on things like data engineering. That was actually my first kind of foray into kind of the programming world and just getting experience with, tech companies, small tech companies at the beginning, but nevertheless a tech company. So I spent about 2 years there. And after that, I ended up applying for a job at Amazon for a software engineer. And one thing led to another. Ended up getting an interview. They flew me out down to Seattle, did I think like a 4 or 5 hour interview loop and kind of the most stressful experience probably in my life. But it ended up working out. So I've been here for around 8 years now. And I guess you can say my tech career and my knowledge of AWS are pretty intertwined because at Amazon, as you can imagine, like Amazon, AWS, we use AWS for pretty much everything, all of our infrastructure. And so I was exposed to it early on. And in order to kind of develop my career, I needed to learn how these different services worked because that's how all the stuff around me was already built. And so I spent a lot of time looking into things. I was naturally curious as well. And given the area I was in, which was in the last mile section of the company, we operated services that had tons and tons of scale, so tens of thousands of requests per second in cases. So I really needed to know not just how the service worked, but how to operate it at this level of scale and make sure that the design decisions that we were making were the right ones so that we didn't kind of blow up the software that we were hosting and cause some outage that could cost millions of dollars per minute, potentially. So that's kind of where I landed. And then eventually I wanted to start a YouTube channel. I was trying to think of ideas for a really, really long time. Like, what's a good idea for a YouTube channel? And one day I was just discussing something with a coworker at work and he asked me like about how to do something. And I was like, oh man, like this is like the 5th time I've explained this to someone. And originally I was like, okay, this could be something. Maybe this is a YouTube candidate idea. So I did a little bit of research and I thought, maybe I'm onto something here. So one thing led to another and made like a bunch of crummy initial videos. Like 4 years later, I look at them in retrospect. I'm like, holy, wow, this is bad. But
You would be bold.
Oh yeah, I know. I laugh at myself. Like, please don't go to my channel. Look at the early stuff. It's embarrassing. But we've all been there. And so yeah, one thing led to another and constantly over time, regular uploads and it's done pretty well for itself. So that's kind of a little bit about my background.
Awesome. So I definitely have to ask a couple of follow-ups there. So
Sure.
You mentioned, getting a job at Amazon. I think a lot of people listening to this, they might aspire to work for one of the FANG companies, either Facebook, Amazon. I know when I was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when I was kind of searching for my current job, it was definitely in the back of my head that it would be cool to kind of land a job at one of these places. And I think that a lot of people, like you said, it stresses them out thinking about this process. So if you can maybe just give, what did you do to kind of prepare for your interview and what did you do to kind of set up this job? And what advice do you maybe have for somebody that's maybe like, hey, maybe this is their dream job working for one of these companies?
Yeah, so I can definitely put my 2 cents in there. So granted, things have changed a lot in, just 8 years, which isn't a big amount of time, but still like things have changed. So I think when I was starting or preparing for my interview, I don't think lead code and things like that were a thing at that point, or at least I didn't know about them, which is kind of funny and thinking about it in retrospect. But in terms of like the studying that I did, I cracked open some of my old textbooks. Like there's some algorithms books that I read, did a lot of practice exercises. They give you a lot of good resources as well in terms of like how they're gonna, how you should frame your responses to certain questions, like using the STAR framework, situation, task, something. But pretty standard stuff these days. So that's how it was. But today things are a little bit different. Like there's tons more resources, tons of great stuff. So I think that like if I were to do it again today, I've seen a bunch of good ones. So LeetCode comes to mind initially. Unfortunately, the interview process at tech companies is kind of archaic, in my opinion, where they're testing you on these kind of obtuse questions that you're probably never going to really apply, maybe ever, while you're working at the company. But in certain cases, you might. But it's not just about the questions; it's about your thought process and how analytical are you? What do you think about all the edge cases? How do you think? That's really what they're trying to assess. And as an interviewer for people that, I've done probably hundreds of interviews at these days, that's what I look for. Like, what is the person thinking through and why are they saying what they're saying? Are they thinking about kind of different approaches? Are they just telling me what I want to hear? Are they giving options and talking about the pros and cons? So I would encourage people that are kind of looking for this opportunity to at these companies to not only have a good kind of technical background, but also be able to communicate your thought process. Because if you just solve the problem, you may not even get the job, because solving the problem isn't actually a prerequisite for getting an offer. It's how you tackle the problem, and that's what we care about. So that's my biggest piece of advice, I would say.
Yeah, and I really like that as well. Like you said, just being able to solve a problem that you've memorized, it doesn't really tell anybody anything. It's like we need to, they're looking for those critical thinking skills, that you understand things conceptually, that you can apply your knowledge kind of generally across the board to the problems that you're going to have to solve. So I think that's great advice. But to transition into the topic of today here.
Sure.
So you mentioned that you've been working with AWS. Your YouTube channel is all about AWS and helping people out with that. And I know that for me personally, I tend to focus on JavaScript and React, and that's kind of where my focus is for my job. But we also use AWS. And when I enter the AWS docs and have to figure out a problem, sometimes it is overwhelming and a little bit tricky. But before we get to like general advice there, maybe we'll just start with what is AWS, and then we'll get into some other kind of tips and general advice for it.
Yeah, sounds good. So AWS stands for Amazon Web Services, for those of you that don't know, and it's a cloud-based infrastructure provider. And I was, you asked me this question, I'm thinking about like the best way to respond to it. And what does cloud-based infrastructure provider mean? Like, to most people, it probably means zero, or like they have no idea what I'm talking about. So maybe the best way to think about this is to think about the world before AWS even existed, in terms of how companies built applications and hosted their infrastructure, right? So rewind maybe 15, 20 years ago, before these companies existed, like Google Cloud, AWS, Azure, or whatever. How did we build applications? Well, say you're a small startup, right? You wanna build a web app, right? And you have a couple requirements for a web app. You need some APIs that you're going to host. You need some boxes, some servers. I probably need a couple databases, or one database maybe. And so how do you deploy this? How do you set this up? So what you would probably do at that time is you would buy some hardware, right? You would go Amazon, whatever, buy some servers, buy some components, put this stuff together. You'd have people that knew how to do this, how to build components and shop for deals and that kind of stuff. Then you would image the machine. So you'd install the operating systems, whatever dependencies that you would need. And then you would maybe put your databases and your APIs on there. And finally, you would launch them, right? And so that's what the world looked like 20 years ago. And so the issue with this is that there's two problems. There's an upfront cost, right? Which is, let's buy all the things that we need, right? And then there's the recurring cost, which is once you buy it, then you need to maintain it. It's not just like it sits there and it works. Like there's always problems that are going to creep up, whether or not they're hardware problems or other types of problems. And then actually there's a third problem too, which is there's people now that also need to be specialists in doing these types of things. So you need to pay those people as well. So from a purely economic perspective, that doesn't really make a lot of sense from a company. Like a company, if I'm a company, I want to solve my problem space, right? I want to, if I'm the case of my old startup, I want to focus on building an app for infectious disease spread and monitoring that. I don't care about hardware, right? Like who cares? That's not how I make money. And so AWS was a fundamental paradigm shift in that model. And so instead of having companies worry and have to order their hardware and, kind of worry about the installation, the setup, the maintenance, AWS said, hey, we can do that a lot better because we have experience. Amazon's like 30 years old. They've been doing this for a long time, right? And so let us worry about that problem. We'll solve it and we'll make sure it's solved. So we'll ensure low cost, availability, high performance, all these kinds of goodies that, as a user, they mean a lot to me. And so they said, we can do this and we'll charge you a nominal amount and we will make these services available for you. And that's exactly what they did. And over time, like they initially started with like a handful of services and they've slowly added to this repertoire or to this repertoire, I guess you can say, of services. And now there's like quite a few that do all sorts of different things. So there's like video streaming services, there's file storage, tons of different database options. There's like over 250 services now, and you can do tons of stuff on AWS. And typically this is actually where people get pretty overwhelmed because like, what do I do? What do I need to learn? And like, what can I ignore is the biggest question that people want to answer.
And kind of with that setup, I think that you described AWS perfectly, like much better than I could have put it, which is obviously why I had you out here. So perfect. I think that sets it up really good. And like you mentioned, they have so many different services that you could spend years in their docs, I feel like, and just keep going through. So kind of for a web developer, is there any particular services that you think are good for them to maybe focus on or learn, or are there any services from AWS that you think are more common for a web developer to use, or what do you kind of think about that?
Yeah. So the thing to know about AWS is that there are some, what I call like bread and butter services, which regardless of your niche, if you're a web developer or if you're a data scientist or just a full stack engineer or just backend, you need to know about because you're going to cross them regardless of what you do. So some of those services are identity and access management, or IAM, which is all about security. AWS operates on like a permission model. If you don't have access to something, you can't use it. So, even if you're a web developer, you need to know how that works. And there's S3 for file storage, right? So just raw file storage, big files, small files. You want to store your CSS, you want to store your JavaScript, you want to store your HTML, that's where you'll put it, right? And then there's the compute tier, which is where do we host our APIs? So are you going to do it using a classic rent a server kind of model? You would use EC2 or Elastic Compute Cloud for that. Or do you want to go with the nice new fancy serverless stuff that everyone's talking about? You go with Lambda for that. Then you maybe you want to think about databases, or maybe this isn't necessarily for a web developer, but still good to know about, like a DynamoDB database, for example, for NoSQL, or RDS for traditional relational. And then another common service to know for regardless of your specialization is CloudWatch, because CloudWatch gives you observability into how the services that you're using are actually performing, both in terms of logs and in terms of metrics that you can track. So those are kind of the general ones that I think, regardless of who you are, you should know about. And in terms of the ones that could be perceived as like web developer specific, a couple come to mind. So there's API Gateway, which is all about creating and hosting your APIs. And so you can use it for REST APIs, HTTP APIs, WebSockets. There's a bunch of different product offerings that they do there. It's very scalable. You can do things like add authorization so that only logged in users can actually access your stuff. There's also Cognito, which is kind of related to that, which is like a user pool. So people can actually authenticate with AWS before they can access your resources. Although like it supports, you can also do this with other identity providers like Okta or Google Workspace or whatever. Then there's also like CloudFront, which is the CDN service for AWS. So if you want to set up your CDN, so achieve higher performance for global users, then you'd want to know about that. And then I know I've been out of the web world for a while, but I know GraphQL is popular. Correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe it isn't. But AWS AppSync, which is the managed GraphQL service. So you don't have to worry about the servers. They do it all for you. They set up your resolvers. They give you some code generation as well to make that easier. And then the final one, which is, it's a little bit prickly. I have a thorny opinion on this one, which is AWS Amplify. Relatively newer service, and the objective of this service was basically for web developers to make it easier to set up, launch, and get going with user UI focused applications. So they make it easier to launch like single page applications, for example, or like phone applications, or iPhone or Android, or I guess React Native, if that's still a thing these days. And the reason I say that it's a little bit of a prickly subject is because what Amplify does, like, it has its own CLI, its own separate part of the AWS console. And what they tried to do with that is they made it easier for people to use it. And the way they made it easier is they abstracted away the details of the AWS services that you need to know about to do what you are trying to do. So what Amplify will say is, like, say you want to add a user login to your app. You say, I want to add the authentication layer in Amplify. And what Amplify will do is it'll go and launch a Cognito user pool, which is an AWS service. And so this is fine, like it's okay when it works, right? And when everything goes perfectly. But when things don't work and you're like, oh, like this isn't actually doing exactly what I want, I want to make like a small modification, then like the whole world blows up. Like you have to figure out now, what did it do? How did it set it up? Is it even possible to change? And then you go down a rabbit hole that you may not be able to dig yourself out of. So those are like the big ones, both in terms of the common services and the web specific ones. But yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah. And we actually use Amplify for our,
so you know.
Yeah, we have a UI focused application. So we kind of fit that use case, and you are 100% right, in which when things work, it's great. When they don't work, you can get lost in an AWS rabbit hole of like trying to figure out, okay, we have Amplify, but we're also using these Cognito user pools, and then there's something kind of like with this interaction that's going wrong, and it's like, it can get pretty tricky there. So I think that was a great rundown of a bunch of common services of AWS. And if someone's listening to this, they're probably like, okay, that's a lot of different services. So if someone's like, okay, I want to learn about, AWS Amplify, or maybe Cognito, or maybe S3 buckets, and how they can maybe use that as doing some sort of caching or something like that, how would you recommend them kind of approaching this service if they wanted to go about learning it? Like, should they just go straight to the AWS docs and then go through some tutorial, or how do you think that they should kind of approach that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's a very common question too, and something that even I today kind of have to deal with, because AWS is launching new services all the time, so I need to keep up. And so over time, like over the past 8 years I've been doing this, I kind of came up with like a mental framework of how I think about tackling a new service when it comes out. And luckily, I did make a YouTube video about this, so it's like fresh on my mind. I can give you guys a link to that, but I'll just explain it to you now. So the first thing I usually do when a new service gets launched is I don't necessarily look at the details of the service. I just try to understand like what is the domain of this thing? Like, are we talking about compute? Are we talking about database, networking? Like, what is this? And who is it for? Because the problem with AWS, not the problem, but something to know about is that there's two classes of services for AWS. There's a class where just kind of they're generic services and they're multi-purpose, where you can set it up and apply it to a lot of different areas. And there's other types of services that are very, very specific to a certain problem. For example, like there's AWS Connect, which is for virtual call centers. And if you're working with that, then it's like, well, you need to know about like how call centers are set up. So you need some kind of domain knowledge about that. So I think about like what is the domain that we're operating in, and I'll try to do a little bit of learning about that if I don't already know it. My second step is usually to watch like an intro video. I'm a visual learner, so I really like watching videos, and why I started making the channel for people that are like me. And when AWS launches a service, they typically pair it with a really brief, like 1 or 2 minute video on the AWS channel. That's kind of like the TLDR of what this service is. And it's like, highly animated. Someone's talking over all the details. They tell you about how it works, what it does, and who it's for, that kind of stuff. That gives me a framework now to say, okay, I know the domain. Now I know like generally how this thing works. And I'm feeling a little bit more confident to get started. But before I jump into the console, which is typically people's next step, right? There is a critical thing to do first, which this typically bites people when they don't, which is to understand the pricing model. Because the pricing model of AWS is pay as you use or pay as you go. And what a lot of people end up doing, unfortunately, is not understanding the pricing of a service before they get into it. And AWS can be a minefield. There's like a lot of buttons that you can press, like little check boxes that seem innocent, that can end up like ballooning your bill to levels you can't imagine. I don't want to scare you people, but there's ways to deal with this, but you just need to understand how it works and how you will be billed. Luckily, AWS is nice about this. So if you make a mistake, you just file a support ticket. They're usually more than willing to help you out. But, you only have a couple chances, or maybe just one if you make a really big mistake. So that's the third thing I usually do. Then I typically like to look at the documentation. There's usually a part of the documentation that says like core concepts or how it works kind of thing. This is something I do since I'm familiar with how AWS documentation works in general. So I'm like, okay, I know how to navigate it. Some people can skip this if they want or just gloss over it, but I usually do that. Then my final step is to jump into the console and like just start playing with things. Like I'll launch a small instance just to see what it does, click around, maybe try and use the API and get more solid understanding. And then like once I gain confidence, then it's time to move to like infrastructure as code if you want to use it in production or at work. So that's generally like my thought process for approaching a new service. And one thing I wanted to add too is like learning a particular service can be valuable, but it's important to learn about the connections between the services because that's where things start to get more complicated. You can learn a single thing and sure, you may be able to do something simple, but the minute you want to like build an app, for example, where it's going to require service A, B, C, D, potentially, you need to know how to wire them up together and how they are related and some of the pitfalls. And one of the things, like this is the most common question I get, like how do you gain confidence to actually build applications and learn services and how they're all connected? So this is something that I was thinking about for a really long time. Like, how do I teach this to people? So I ended up coming up with a course that I built out for this specific purpose for people that are struggling with AWS. Maybe they got their certification, and like certification is a whole other thing, which is like you just get a piece of paper. It's like, oh, put me in the war, basically. It doesn't work like that, right? You need to build and like do things in the console and get your hands dirty to learn. So in this course, it's basically like a lab style where you're faced with a problem. And I walk you through my thought process of like, okay, here's the problem. Here's the different categories of AWS services that we're going to need to tackle this. And within each category, there's like 1, 2, or 3 services. And cross this one out for reasons. And here's a better option that is, in terms of how much we need to scale or maybe some of the requirements of the project itself. So I walk you through that. I explain it all the way through. I show you how I design it and how everything is connected and why, and then we go out and actually build the thing. And it's like a hands-on thing. I called it the AWS Learning Accelerator because I was basically trying to give people like the TLDR of learning AWS. I can give you a link where maybe you can put it in the description section or something.
Absolutely. Real quick, where could people kind of find that if that sounds awesome to them?
Yeah, so you can go to my website. It's beabetterdev.com, and there should be a banner on the top. I believe it's like my courses or something like that. Yeah, it's here. So I just checked while we were talking. And then there's a section there where it'll link you.
Cool. And then the YouTube channel is also Be a Better Dev as well.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
they can check that as well. And we'll let you kind of plug some things later too if you'd like. Cool. But I really like your kind of framework for learning a new service. And I think that your general framework, it applies more than just AWS. It applies to learning really anything when it comes to web development and stuff like that. As I know that when I'm learning like a new JavaScript library, which seems like what comes out new every single day, it's like, okay, step one is like, what problem does this library or does this framework actually try to solve? And how does it compare to some other solutions out there?
Why is it better or worse? Or why is it different?
Yep. And then from there, it's like, okay, if I see that it this seems good. It seems like it solves a common problem or something like that, and it's worth learning. And from there, it's like, okay, do they have some sort of like explainer video to give me the TLDR of this? Because as I'm the same way as you, I'm a visual learner. I like to be able to see examples of different things. So I'll kind of get the TLDR. And then usually from there, it's a matter of like jumping into their docs and then building out, like sometimes they'll have like a demo application that you can build alongside the docs, and then you're kind of free to go build your own stuff with it. And I think that's a really good approach to things. So
yeah,
I really like that learning model just in general there. And as you mentioned with AWS, there might be that kind of extra step to where you have to see how this service kind of relates to other services and how they all kind of connect together there. Because I know that for us, for example, we use AWS, we use Cognito, we use the S3 buckets, and we use several different services. So integrating those all together there's definitely some complexity to that with your entire architecture of your application there. So I think that covers kind of what AWS is, common services, and how to learn a service. But are there any kind of common mistakes that someone makes when they start using AWS? I know that, maybe we might have covered some mistakes there in regards to the learning process, like just jumping straight to the code and not understanding conceptually what a problem solves. But are there any other kind of common mistakes that people make when using AWS?
Yeah, so this is a good question too. There are quite a few, and I'm a big fan of reading the AWS subreddit. It's reddit.com/AWS or something, /r/AWS. And about every week, there's a post on the subreddit of someone that's like, I have a bill for $100 or some number. And it's like, oh man, sorry, dude. So this happens extremely common, this type of thing. And so I actually was thinking about this problem, like what are the things that people run into as issues, and like how can I help, kind of thing. And so I similarly made another YouTube video about this, of basically a five-step new account checklist of things that you should do when you begin, just so you can protect yourself. Because like I said, like you're putting your credit card in, like there's buttons that you can press that you may not completely understand. So it's kind of a series of things that you do. And so there's a couple that I can think of off the top of my head. So the first one is when you initially create your account, the first thing you're supposed to do, like absolute first thing, set up multi-factor authentication. Because, we're in a password age where people can have keyloggers. There's your computer can get hacked. You can reuse a password. And I guarantee you there's people out there that have maybe scripts that are trying to just, brute force attack people's accounts and figure out passwords. Because it's like the keys to the kingdom. If someone can get your AWS account, then they can do a lot of damage. Like there's people that can get massive bills, or people can mine Bitcoin or launch, tens of thousands of EC2 instances if they want. AWS tries to protect against this kind of stuff, but it's not foolproof. So that's the first thing to do. The other thing is to stop using what's called the root user, which when you sign up for AWS account, you sign in with your email that you use to register the account. That's called the root user, which is kind of like the Uber user for your account. And what you're supposed to do after is create a child of your root user, which is like a normal user. And you can still have all the good permissions, like administrator access, all the stuff that you want to do. But if something ever happens to your user account, you can sign into your root user account and basically revoke all the credentials, so you can control things just in case. So that's another thing that you should do pretty much right away, and set up MFA for both. And then the third one, which is underrated as well, but pretty powerful, is to set up billing alerts. Like I said, like sometimes people like accidentally click things, or maybe you're expected to spend nothing or zero, and you just want to make sure that you're not spending anything. And so AWS has a feature where you can set up a billing alert. And what I do, like on some of my accounts, like my dormant accounts, I set up the billing alert to be anything above a penny. So if I accidentally click something that's generating some kind of cost, I'll be immediately notified via email. I'm like, okay, I screwed something up, or someone hacked my account, which, it's a different problem. But at least I'll know about it right away. I can go fix it right away, instead of, 6 months after the fact, someone is charging my credit card for some sum that I wasn't really happy about. So those are the three things, but I have a couple other ones on that video I can link you to as well, so people can stay informed.
Perfect. And I think those billing alerts are super helpful. I know that for us in our professional application, there was a time to where we got a billing alert for a certain amount per month, and it was quite higher than other months. And we realized that when we kind of set up some new services, we forgot to shut down some other services. So we're still being billed for those and charged for those. And this billing alert saved us for probably hundreds, if not thousands of dollars kind of down the road because we had that set up. So
I'm sure your CEO was happy.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe as just a final question here, Daniel, if people are considering these different services, they're probably also aware that Microsoft has Azure and they offer some different services there. And then you also have Google Cloud Platform. And it seems like all these kind of tech giants are all kind of competing with each other for these different services and stuff like that. So I'm not sure if you have experience with Azure or Google Cloud Platform or some other services, but is there a particular reason you've kind of gone the AWS route, or how do you kind of think about that?
Yeah, so I think just because of where my career has progressed, I've naturally trended towards AWS, and like that put me on a path that is like just hard into AWS. Even if I wanted to change, I don't think I could, because now I have all these business and YouTube channel and all these things. But like Azure and Google Cloud, like they are very similar, right? And the thing that I want to emphasize is that although these are different companies, the fundamental problems that they are solving are similar. And so I have a very strong confidence that if I had to learn Google Cloud or Azure, I could jump in there and I could say to myself, what is this thing? How is that related to something that I already know, like a type of problem or a type of service? And I'd be very quickly be able to figure it out. And so although these are different things, they are very similar. So if you understand the fundamentals and the building blocks, then it's just a question of which of these providers are you currently working with. And sure, there's going to be a little bit of learning curve because everyone does things slightly different, but there are very similar problems that are being solved, like API hosting, like compute, like event orchestration, like AWS has Lambda functions, Azure may have something else. Like we're speaking different languages, but it's the same subject matter. So unfortunately, I never really got into Azure or cloud because of my investment in my specific area. But I don't know, maybe one day I'll spin up an account and click around just to say that I did. But for now, I'm pretty happy where I am.
Yeah. And I 100% agree. If you understand the problems that AWS is solving and you understand how kind of that works and how things are kind of linked together, it's to me very similar to how if you understand the fundamentals of web development, like JavaScript, CSS, HTML, you can understand, the new JavaScript framework, and you can switch frameworks pretty easily because the underlying kind of problems you're solving and the underlying fundamentals are kind of the same across the board. So I know if it were me, I would probably just pick one, focus on it, learn the different problems. And then if you have a job down the line that they use, Google Cloud Platform or something else, I think the transition would be pretty easy that way. But with that, Daniel, we are up on time here. So is there anywhere that we mention your YouTube channel and as well as your website, but just to kind of mention those again, and if there's anywhere else that people can find you, where can they kind of go for that?
Yeah, I also have a newsletter as well. You can go to my website. There should be a banner on the top to find it. Or you can go to mailinglist.beabetterdev.com to sign up. I do like AWS summary announcements. I also like just summarize all my videos or things that are important. If you have a specific question, you can reach me at daniel@beabetterdev.com. I try to respond within a couple days at best, but we have a newborn child now, so I don't know how quick I'll be. But yeah, besides my YouTube channel and email and mailing list, that's pretty much how to reach me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today.
Cool. Thanks for having me. Take care.